Hello, Garland Nixon here. Did Angela Merkel shock the Russians with her recent statements about the Minsk Accord being a ruse so that Ukraine could get stronger? Maybe not. Let's talk. Hello, Garland Nixon here. So let's start with this. Let's get right to the point. And I'm going to share the screen with you. I think it is important. This is from RT, and I think it's important to use an RT story. Okay, how can we explain Angela Merkel's bombshell revelations about the Ukraine peace deal? For those of you who might not have been paying attention recently, Angela Merkel made some statements that implied that the original deal, so what you need to know is 2014, the United States assisted the fascists in Ukraine to overthrow what was then the duly elected and democratically chosen government. I'm not saying that Viktor Yanukovych by any stretch of the imagination was some kind of an angel, but he was the one that the Ukrainian people had chosen in the infamous Maidan Square putsch, shall we call it. The United States worked with the far right groups and overthrew the government and installed a guy named Petro Poroshenko. Now, recently, to lead into this story, recently Petro Poroshenko made a statement. What happened? Well, let me get out of this so we can talk. We can talk about that. So what happened? For this will be a good start for people who may not know a lot about this. I'll make it quick. After the U.S. worked to overthrow the government of Ukraine on Russia's border, the Ukraine actually means borderland. The Russians, needless to say, weren't thrilled with it. There was a bit of a fracas going on, and at some point, the Russian army had, and the Russians and the Lugansk People's Republic, a militia, shall we say, had the Ukrainian army surrounded them, could have annihilated them. The Ukrainians then, along with the West, particularly France and Germany, came up with an agreement called the Minsk Accords, Minsk, Belarus. And these were supposedly a deal that would give the Donbass, Russian-speaking regions of Ukraine some level of autonomy. There would be a ceasefire. But bottom line, they were going to make a deal. They made a deal, right? An agreement. And the Russians decided not to annihilate the Ukrainian military. Now, at that time. Now, since then, Petro Poroshenko, who the United States then installed as the president, Poroshenko has said, well, that agreement we made with the Russians was, there's an old saying about diplomacy. Diplomacy is the art of saying nice doggy until you can find a rock, right? Well, that's what they did. It's not supposed to be that way, but for the cynical, it is. And so cynically, Petro Poroshenko has admitted, hey, you know what? We just made that agreement so we could build up our military to fight them later. In other words, it was a ruse. So this is not the first time we've heard it. Okay, so now let's go to this story. Angela Merkel recently, and I think there's some things I'm going to cover it, and we're going to talk about it a bit. So Angela Merkel, former chancellor, said, and it's caused a stir, the 2014 Minsk agreements were an attempt to give Ukrainian time, and it used that time to become stronger. As you can see today, Ukraine of 2014, 2015 is not the Ukraine of today, right? So what is the implication here? The implication is that the same as Petro Poroshenko. Look, we were lying to the Russians. It was all a fraud. We told them, look, please back away. They had the upper hand. They could have destroyed the Ukrainian army. Instead, we say, hey, we want peace. Well, they didn't really want peace. We wanted war, but they had the upper hand. It's kind of like a person's got you down and you say, please, please spare me, spare me. And they say, well, I don't know. Look, I promise if you spare me, I'll do anything. And at the time you're saying that, you got a knife behind your back. You just want to say, spare me, enough time to get the upper hand so they can back up and say, okay, you know what? I have to, but I'll let you go. Stand up and go about your way. And you stand up and stab them. because it was all a fraud. You were lying. You just wanted to get the upper hand. So you deceived your attacker and you pretended to be acting in good faith. And really you were acting in a cynical manner just so you could kill them. Right. Okay. Well, that's what Petro Poroshenko said. And apparently it appears that that's what Angela Merkel has admitted. Now, there's some discussion about, she's saying that now. At the time, did she really intend to go forward with the Minsk Accords? Well, here's the thing about it. What we see now is that the European countries do not have the sovereignty and the independence to make decisions on behalf of their own foreign policy needs, their own political or economic needs. They don't have that authority or autonomy. So part of it is this. If you're going to discuss whether or not Angela Merkel or the French or the Germans, when they made that deal with Russia, intended to keep the deal, in the context of that discussion, you have to ask yourself, answer this question: did they have the authority to um, to push that deal? Did they have the authority to make the deal work? Because if you ask whether they intended to do it, you have to ask whether they had the authority to do it. And the answer clearly is no. So the next question is this: did they know whether or not they had the authority? And that's important, because when the French and the Germans shook hands on a deal with the Ukrainians and the Donbass, the Donbass People's Republic, etc., right? If they knew, we have no authority here, we're going to shake hands on this deal, but it ain't really our deal, we got to ask Uncle Sam in DC what to do, then in a way it was a fraud, because they were pretending. And here's the part about that's important. At the time, Merkel and whoever it wasn't Macron, whoever it was in charge of France at that time, shook hands on a deal, but they knew that they didn't have the authority to support that deal, to see that deal through. So the real lie was they were pretending it. And let me say this: it's the same lie that the German and the French and the European leaders must push on their own people. You see, the leader of Germany and France and Spain have to say to their own people, we have independence and sovereignty, when they know they don't have any independence and sovereignty. They know that they're just colonies of the U.S. empire, and they have to do whatever the U.S. empire in D.C. tells them to do. So they're perpetrating a lie to their own people, the lie being, I'm the leader of your country and I'm acting on your behalf. When in reality, they're not the leader of the country. They are effectively what the British Empire would call a governor or a viceroy of a colony. You have a colonial project out here, and you appoint a viceroy or a governor to be in charge of the colonial project, right? But that viceroy or that governor is not acting on behalf of the people of the colony. It's acting to make sure that the people on the colony are in line with what the colonial power wants. So whoever was in charge of the 13 colonies here in the US, they weren't acting on behalf of the 13 colonies. They were acting on behalf of the British Crown to ensure that the people in the 13 colonies did what the British Crown wanted them to do. And in the same way, Merkel, Macron, any of them, the leaders in Europe, know that they're not acting, because these are colonies, that they're just a viceroy. So they're not acting on behalf of the people in their country. They're acting on, and all of this stuff is important, on behalf of the colonial power, which is the United States. These things are very important as we move forward with this discussion. So what have we determined? That the Russians now are looking at potential um, diplomatic rivals, whatever you want to call them, people that they need to work with, and they're seeing that those people basically shook hands on a deal with them earlier that they had no intention of keeping. So the question is that going to change the way the Russians view this conflict and how they end it? I don't think so. Let me give you a little bit more here. This is important stuff. Let's go all the way back to 2022, to March of 2021, right? Lavrov says the U.S. is unable to reach agreements, calls for coalition against sanctions, right? So what does he say back then? The United States Somebody calling me. For Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said he believes Washington's unilateral withdrawal from the nuclear deal proves the violation of international law and its inability to reach other agreements. Listen to this. Uh, Said he believes Washington's unilateral withdrawal from the nuclear deal proves the violation of international law and its inability to reach agreements with other countries. The United States withdrew from the Iran nuclear deal and is now trying to revive it. Not only did it suspend its commitments, but it also barred other countries from complying with UN Security Council resolutions. This is a clear violation of international law. And listen to the second thing he says, and shows the country's complete inability to negotiate, right? So what is he saying? What is he saying right there? Look at this date, March 22, 2021. That far back, Sergei Lavrov said about the United States, they're unable. He even used a term at one time where he called them like the US was agreement incapable. So he knew, number one, the Russians knew long ago that the United States was not going to keep its agreements, right? So let's not forget in December of 19, and today, believe it or not, is December 17th, just about a year ago, the Russians submitted, and look at this, they submitted a list of security demands to the US, right? And they said, we got to do these things or we could take military technical actions. In other words, don't do this stuff, there's going to be war, right? So they submitted them to the US. And what did the Russians say then? They said, we're not submitting these to the EU. We're not submitting to any of the countries in NATO because there's only one country in charge, that's the US. So when they submitted their demands prior to going to war, right, they basically said, we won't go to war if you're not at least willing to negotiate with these demands. The U.S. said, we're not listening to that. Get out of here. Come on. Basically, NATO, I mean, Jens Stoltenberg said something, but the Russians don't care. Nobody cares. The Russians made it clear the only people that we're willing to negotiate with is the Americans. But remember, even before that, Sergei Lavrov had said they're agreement incapable. So I think that the request for dialogue and diplomacy over Russia's security agreements was pro forma, shall we say, performative. It was something that they did because they knew they needed to do that so that they could argue we did everything within our power. You know, kind of when you go to court, you have to argue, a judge may throw a case out because he says you haven't done anything, you haven't exhausted all means that you had, all avenues that you had to try to address this issue, right? To try to resolve this issue. So they'll throw a case out and say, sorry, you didn't go do everything you could to try to resolve it before you came to court. You got other avenues. You can't come back here to court until you've addressed the other avenues. I think Russia's position was, we want to be able to say we tried. We know you're not going to go do what we know you're not going to listen, but we want to say we tried. And additionally, they also said, as I said, we're only talking to the US. This NATO crap, this EU crap is a joke. We're only talking to the US. They're the ones that make the decisions. And they also actually said, we don't believe that they're going to talk about this, but we're going to do what we need to do and say, hey, are you down with some kind of diplomacy or what? No, okay, boom, that's it for Ukraine. That was the move, right? But as I said, so we have evidence already that the Russians knew. Let's put a couple of things together based on the articles that I had so far, that the Russians knew and said the United States is not capable of making agreements and holding to the agreements, right? That they said, we know when it comes to negotiating about our security with Europe, that Europe has no say, that we can only talk to the US. But remember, they said the US is agreement incapable. So here's my point that I'm getting at. The point that I'm getting at is you have people saying, were the Russians shocked and surprised by Angela Merkel as we get back? We'll go back to that just so you know. Angela Merkel saying, and let's just go with that one thing, saying the 2014 Minsk agreements were an attempt to give Ukraine time, and it used that time to become stronger, as you can see today. Well, Ukraine didn't become stronger, and it didn't use that time. NATO, which is the United States, used that time to more heavily arm Ukraine, to dig trenches and pillboxes. So what happened? All it was, as she's saying, was it was a time for NATO to NATOize Ukraine and prepare it for war with Russia. NATO had already decided that Ukraine was going to war with Russia. And as Angela Merkel said, we lied to the Russians so we could hold them off enough to get ready for war. And as you can see, Ukraine's much more ready for war now that it's been armed to the teeth by NATO than it was before. Now, don't get me wrong; they're still going to lose, but they're more ready to fight. And the neocons don't care if they lose. The neocons' plan is their plan always was to fight as long as they possibly could until they run out of Ukrainians. All right, so that's all important. Well, why is that important? Because it addresses the issue of, and I think this is the big issue, people arguing that Angela Merkel's bombshell revelations that the US was lying and the US's vassals, its colonies, were lying to the Russians when they did set up the Minsk agreements. And now that she said that, the Russians are shocked and surprised or whatever. And now they're going to do something different, which is they're not going to have they're not going to have a deal, do diplomacy because they don't trust the US. Now, I would say, based on what I put together, the Russians already knew that. They already said, we can't trust these people. They're not capable of making a deal. And even if you make a deal with them, they ain't going to keep it. So all Angela Merkel did was she put a cherry on top of the sundae that they were already eating. They already knew that. She's like, yeah, we lied to them just so we could hopefully get Ukraine a little bit stronger and then bop them in the nose and give them a bloody nose. The Russians are like, yeah, right. Tell us something we didn't know. Hey, good statement there, Captain Obvious, right? Now let's continue. Next, got another article, very much related. And the article says, and this is from TASS, which is the Russian news agency, Russia-NATO dialogue out of the question at this point. Moscow has no plans to go back to last year's initiatives on security guarantees. Remember, a year ago, the Russians gave a list of security guarantees to the West and said, let's do diplomacy about it. As I said, I think it was pro forma, but whatever the case may be. Moscow says, we ain't going back to that. So let's look at this article in TASS. Dialogue between Russia and NATO is out of the question amid the current develops. A source in Moscow told TASS, any dialogue with NATO as an organization is out of the question now. Right? It's to the point that when representatives of NATO as an organization appear at universal international platforms, we will demand that they should not be there, he said, adding that an exception could only be made for specific platforms, such as the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. According to the source, Russia should not be expected to make a conceptual return to the proposals on security guarantees that it sent to the United States and NATO a year ago. We won't be the ones to do it, he noted. The reason is that if we do, the need will arise to update the position, which cannot be updated because everything depends on how the situation on the ground unfolds during the special military operation, right? So let's talk about that. What Russia's saying, basically, as I see it, is, look, and think about this. I can't trust you. I'm making a deal with you and you promise to pay me and you don't pay me. If I make a deal with you the next time, the only thing I'm making payment in is MIH, money in hand. Let's make a deal with this time, Garland. I want to buy that bicycle and I'll give you $250, but you didn't pay me the last time. But I promise I'll pay you this time. You want that bicycle? Yeah, put some money in my hand to the tune of $250. You don't put $250 in my hand, you don't get that bicycle. Why? Because you lied, you took me out once. There's nothing to be learned by getting kicked by the same mule twice. You got me one time, that's on me. It ain't happening again. That's what they're saying. You lied to us once, and now you're giving weapons to Ukraine. You're attacking us. You're lying about what's going on. You're doing an information war. You're stealing our money. That's what the Russians are saying. They're saying, look, the time for talking is behind us. Here's what we're getting ready to do here. We're going to do our talking on the ground in Ukraine. So what they're saying is this. They have to create an environment, right, where the West wants to talk to them. So there's 10 million Ukrainian refugees running across the border, heading into Western Europe. The people in Western Europe are freezing their toes off. Their economies are going to hell, right? The Ukrainian military and or their military, their infrastructure, and their political infrastructure are all collapsing. At that point, Nixon said it. He said, the time to negotiate is when I got you on the floor with my foot on your neck. That's what the Russians are saying now. They're saying the time that we're going to be ready to negotiate is when we got you on the ground, when you come to us. Don't ask us to come to you. We're going to now take care of business. That's what basically the Russians are saying. You guys want to tell everybody that the Ukrainians are going to win? Let's find out on the battlefield if the Ukrainians are going to win. If you say they're going to win, then you got no gripes. If they win, well, then I guess you got us. But the Russians are saying that ain't going to happen. And the Russians are also saying, we're not going to deal with the info war. You want to go write stories in the New York Times. You want to write stories in the Washington Post and the BBC about how we're running out of missiles. We're just about out of missiles. We're out of everything. Our troops are mutinying, running for their lives. The Azov battalion has surrounded Moscow and they're about to put up their Nazi flag in Red Square. Whatever, you go ahead, write all that stuff. We're going to do some work on the battlefield. And after that, we'll see if you're ready to talk. I think that's where the Russians are. They're like, we're going to do work. We're going to do our work on the battlefield. And we'll chat to you later at this point. Because look what they say. Macron's words about guarantees to Moscow. Recently, French President Emmanuel Macron said, we're going to have to talk to Russia about some security agreements. In other words, we need to talk to them. Hey, we need to start, bending a little bit. Perhaps we've been a bit too rigid, right? Here's what they say. There's nothing. Well, let me bring that up. So Macron has said that. So now the Russians say there is nothing behind French President Emmanuel Macron's words about the need to provide security guarantees to Moscow, a Russian source told TASS. Quote, I'm sure that there's nothing behind it. It's nothing but an attempt to prove himself. There's no clear position and counter proposals behind it. Now, keep in mind something. Macron said, look, we're going to have to talk to Russia at some point. We're going to have to take into account their security needs and come up with some kind of security agreements. But what do the Russians say? You ain't said nothing, bro. You have not said a word, brother. You just said some vague and amorphous statement about it. We need it, as again, we need something concrete. If Macron says, okay, we need to move NATO back to the pre-1991 borders. Their infrastructure needs to come off. The missile launchers need to come off Russia's border. Now that Russia's like, we can talk Turkey if you say that. We're trying to hear you. We can hear you at least if you say that. We'll say you're making an effort if you say that. But if you just give some general, yeah, we're going to have to talk to the Russians and take into account their security needs, the Russians are like, we ain't trying to hear that. It's nothing. Unless you give us something concrete, definitive, just more fluff. And they say, according to him, there is no reason to expect anyone to act as a mediator between Russia and Ukraine because it's not about conveying any signals. But the problem is that the position of the parties is incompatible. That is the important statement. That is the important statement in all of this, in this whole paragraph and everything. The Russians say, the problem is the positions of the parties are incompatible. Now, I've used different analogies. One of them is, do you think the Russians can make a deal with the neocons in Washington? And I say, do you think sheep can make a deal with wolves? Hey, man, we want to make a deal where you don't eat us. And the wolves are like, but if we don't eat you, we'll starve. We're wolves. It's what we do. We can't make a deal that we don't eat sheep because we're sheep eaters. So even if we make a deal that we don't eat sheep, we still got to eat you. Nothing personal. It's who we are. It's in the job description. Wolves. If you go back to my house and you go into my file cabinet and you pull out my job description for what I do, wolf, number one, right there, eats sheep. Sorry, pal. Nothing personal. That's where we are, right? The positions of the parties. This is what the Russians say, and this is what they've come to the conclusion of. The problem is that the positions of the parties are incompatible. Let me explain what that means, in my opinion. Look, you have the cover story. We got to go here. The neocons have a cover story. The cover story is NATO is a defensive organization, and we're using it to defend um, Europe from an aggressive Russia that wants to invade Europe. That's the story, but it's a lie. The truth is, NATO is an aggressive military organization. And you can see that because now the US has decided to use NATO to go after China too. NATO now, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the last time I checked, China doesn't border the Atlantic, has now become the North Atlantic. I guess it was like the Great Atlantic and Pacific Tea Company. Now it's the North Atlantic and Pacific War Company. So NATO now is, the truth is coming out. Hey, we're here to protect Europe from Russia. Oh, by the way, we got to deal with China too. Why? Because they're a threat. Well, to what? To the U.S. empire being the world hegemon. You know, the cat's out of the bag right now. So NATO is what it is. So the Russians are saying, basically, look, we know what time it is. Your cover story is you're going to protect Europe from us. But you know, we know, and the rest of the world knows we have no intention on invading Europe. However, the Russians have noticed that the US has surrounded them with military bases, and might I add, with biological research facilities. So the exoteric story, the outside story, right? The cover story is NATO is here to protect Europe from Russia. The esoteric, the inside story is NATO is a means to, um, how can I put this? Destabilize Russia to a point where it can be taken over, disassembled, balkanized, as they say, right? So we can tear it to shreds, like kind of like they did Africa back in the day. You get this portion of Russia, you get that portion, you get this portion, you get that portion. Now, if you understand the US empire, this is the way it works. If they were to be able to do this, which they can't, but let's just say, for the sake of argument, the US suddenly, Putin jumped off a cliff and killed himself, and the lead head of Russia called Biden and said, "Uncle, the country is yours." Now, according to common wisdom of imperialists, at that point, Russia would be divided up amongst France would get some. No, the US empire would then say, "It's all ours, shut up," to Europe. They just simply say, "Thanks a lot for helping us take Russia. And you thought you were going to get some of it. Yeah, we did tell you were going to get some, didn't we? Yeah, well, we lied. You'll get nothing." The US empire is not trustworthy. They do, if they got Russia, they do the same damn thing to their allies that they're blowing up their pipelines. They'd say, "Screw you, we lied, you get nothing, shut up. Be happy that we allow you to the effrontery to exist in our presence." And that'd be that. It ain't going to happen, but I'm just saying, if they got it, they wouldn't share anything with anybody, because that ain't who they are. That's not the nature of empire. But it's not happening. Not happening, not happening. So what the Russians have figured out is this: we're not acting on your cover story. We're not going to act on this game, this ruse that you're protecting Europe from us. We're acting on the truth, on the real story. The Russians are acting on the real story, which is you're trying to surround Russia, overthrow them, surround China, overthrow them. That what we have is a empire that was a unipolar power. But now Russia, Iran, China, India, they're rising world powers, and the US empire just says we got to beat everybody else down. They're going to pass us, their technology is going to pass us, their economies might pass us. We can't have anybody else who can challenge our world hegemony. We got to knock them down. That's the reality. So Russia's not playing around, goofing around on the edges with this cover story. They're like, look, our positions are not compatible. We can't, the sheep can't go to the wolf and say, "Let's make a deal." The sheep has to defeat the wolf. In politics, in reality, there are times when particular parties look at another party and say, "We can't work out a deal. That guy wants to kill me." You know, you walk out of an alley, or you're walking down the street, and some guy confronts you and says, "Give me your money." And he pulls out a knife. Here's the bottom line: there ain't no bargain to be made. At that point, he's got a knife. And now you got a couple options. Can you run away and get away? If you can, that's an option. Another option you've got is hand him your money, knowing that he may try to kill me anyway. So you kind of back off and throw your wallet at him and hope he does that. You've got a lot of options. Another one is go to war, right? You can throw that a wallet in his face and go to the night. If you are trained in how to disarm an attacker with an edged weapon, right? Then you may attempt to employ the tactics which you've trained and practiced many, many times, and you may be able to save your life that way. But you got some options. But you know that ain't a guy that wants to stand there and bargain with you. He wants to rob you and take your stuff and maybe kill you, murder you, rape you, whatever it is he wants to do. You've got to deal with the reality of that. I think that's how the Russians see this. Out at that point, your position is incompatible with your attacker. Your attacker wants full power. They want to take whatever you have, and then they want the authority to do whatever they can to you. If it's murder you, rape you, kill you, whatever they want to do, they want the full authority to do anything they want with you, and you don't want them that. Your positions are incompatible. There's no way to diplomacy your way out of that. I think that's what the Russians are saying. There's no diplomacy with people who want to take everything we got, who want to take our country apart, take everything we got, impoverish them. And they're let's face it, let's be honest, they're right. There's a RAND study from 2019. There's a book called The Grand Chessboard written by Zbigniew Brzezinski. The U.S. has come out in any manner of ways and said, we want to rob Russia blind, take all of their stuff and split them amongst ourselves. But meanwhile, we want our allies and friends to think they get a piece of it, which they won't. So where we are now is this. So here's let me sum it all up in how I see it. Yes, the Russians heard Angela Merkel and Petro Poroshenko say, when we signed the Minsk agreement deal, it was a lie. And we just did that so we could arm Ukraine so they could go to war with Russia. The Russians already knew and already stated that they had no trust with the U.S. empire. They'd already said that prior to this, so this wasn't a shock to them. The Russians already, and they talked about, in particular, they talked about what? The nuclear deal. So they already knew that. Now, let me give you another angle. When the Merkel came out and Poroshenko came out, they did the Russians a favor because the Russians were already there. What did the Russians really need to do? I think the Russians always knew they were never, at first they thought it's possible we could get a deal. And they seem to have had one in March, like a month or so, two after the wars. They seemed to have had a deal. And the U.S. came in. I think some of the Ukrainians probably bargained in good faith and said, okay, let's get a deal. And they actually had a deal. And then Boris Johnson came in at the behest of the Biden administration and killed the deal. And I think the Russians probably suspected that may happen. But when it happened, they knew where they were. They're like, man, we're not shocked. And even if we had a deal with these people, we know we can't trust the West very well. So this happened. Here's what I think. The Russians kept fighting, knowing they were going to have to fight their way out of this. That was going to be the end, that they were going to have to impose a solution on their border. And it's their border, and they will impose a solution. But I think they needed, because of their allies, to continue to take the moral high ground, right? They needed to continue to tell their allies, look, guys, we're doing everything that we can to do diplomacy. We're, China, India, you guys, look, we did what we had to do. We didn't want to fight, but you know how these assholes are. So we had to fight, and we're working. If there's any way we can get a diplomatic solution at any time, we'll back out and we'll stop fighting and we'll do the diplomatic solution. So we're ready to do that. So even though the Russians knew they were dealing with people that they couldn't trust, they continually reassured their allies, look, if there is a deal, we'll take it. If there is a way to do diplomacy, we'll take it, even though they knew there wasn't. But what Poroshenko came out, and I mean, he's a schmuck, he's a nobody, but Merkel is a big name. She's well known. And might I add this, you got a lot of people in Europe and around the world looking at Angela Merkel and saying, well, if Angela Merkel was here, this problem wouldn't have happened. If Angela Merkel was here, she wouldn't have let him do this. If Angela Merkel, this idea that Merkel is, now that she's out of power, that she's kind of some kind of a great and powerful figure, and that she'd have stood up to the U.S. empire, why she wouldn't have let him get away with that, right? Well, I'll put it like this. You can't have less balls than Schultz. It's impossible for any human being in life to be a weaker schmuck than Olaf Schultz. But so she wasn't weaker than him. No, she wasn't, because that's not humanly possible. A caterpillar has a stronger spine. A caterpillar, a slug, think of the softest, a sea cucumber, I don't know, whatever you can think of that's mushy, right? Has a stronger, the Pillsbury Doughboy has more of a stronger, stiffer spine than Olaf Schultz. So of course Merkel has a more spine than that scumbag, that just absolute chump. But if you believe she'd stand up against the US empire under these circumstances, I don't believe she would, for this reason. She lives in a country that's occupied by the US bases. She knows, what the hell, they killed JFK. What the hell you think they'd do to you if you got in their way? They all know that. They've seen the US overthrow Gough Whitlam in the UK. They've seen the US spend money in Greece to and they heard Mike Pompeo say that if Jeremy Corbyn was winning, looked like he was winning, the US empire would step in to deal with it. They know, she knows, like I know, like you know, that there's not a country in Europe that has a smidgen of sovereignty. And that the ones that try to exercise sovereignty, not only does the U.S. come down on them, the feckless, backstab and lying comprador class leaders in the EU, everybody from the von der Leyens to the rest, when Viktor Orban says, I don't want to go along with this stuff because it's going to hurt my population, they all jump on him. They're all part of this thing, right? So what happened was this. Now, here's what I'm saying. She did the Russians a favor, because the Russians had to say to their allies, we're doing everything we can. We're trying to get a diplomatic solution, but right now we don't have one, and we're going to continue fighting, and we're going to continue to work for a diplomatic solution. Now, when Angela Merkel came out, a person who, dare I use the word, is respected, if I could use that about any European leader, which I think it would be highly inappropriate, but I'll use it under these circumstances for dramatic effect. A respected leader such as Angela Merkel coming out and telling the truth on this, coming out and saying, yeah, we lied to the Russians back then. We lied to them. We came out and we told them that we wanted a deal, but we didn't want a deal. We just wanted them to step down for a while so we could sharpen up the knives to stick right in their friggin' gullets. We lied to those bastards. We thought, if we can just get the Russians to believe us and just back off for a little while, we'll kill them. If we can just get them to turn their heads, we'll hit them in the back of the head with a baseball bat and kill them dead. But we've got to get them to trust us. If only we can get them to trust us. The only way we can truly deceive the Russians is if we can get them to trust us. So what Angela Merkel said was, we were able in 2014 to gain the Russians' trust. And when we gained the Russians' trust, that's when we deceived them, because they never saw it coming. They thought we were the good guys. And once we got them thinking that we were the good guys, wham, we deceived them right then, because they thought we were okay. They didn't realize we were lying to them. They never saw it coming. Now, what the Russians can do now is fold their hands and look at their allies. They can look at India. They can look at China. They can look at Iran, and they can say, I present to you the U.S. empire. They can say to Iran and India, well, we told you that we were doing everything we could to get a deal with these people. You heard them, didn't you? You read them, didn't you? Now, what do you think, India and China and Africa and all of our allies? When we told you we couldn't get a deal with these bastards, you couldn't trust them as far as you could throw an aircraft carrier, but that we were going to continue to try. And now they have come out and they have said, we deceived them into a deal before and it was a lie, and boom, we shanked them right in the back. What do you think now? So now the Russians, now that this is out, the Russians no longer have to say to their allies, we're trying diplomacy. They no longer have to say to the world, we're working on diplomacy. Why? Because the cat is out of the bag. There is no diplomacy. There's no possibility for diplomacy. As the Russians said, how'd they put it? The positions of the parties are incompatible. So what did they say? The positions of the U.S. empire is, we will deceive you so that we can get the upper hand, and then we will stick a shank right in your gut. We ain't making, what would you do? And of course, the allies of the Russians will then say, yeah, I see what you're saying. You can't trust those sons of bitches. That's what it is. So Angela Merkel actually did the Russians a favor. She actually proved that what the Russians were saying to their allies all along was true. She actually, Petro Poroshenko said it, but as I said, he's a nobody. You know, he's the with the things that we've heard out of some of the Arestovich and some of these other Ukrainians. You know, every other day the Russians shot 40 missiles and the Ukrainians shot down 45. The Russians lost 1 million men. The one valiant Ukrainian soldier who was out of bullets, but he had a bayonet, took out an entire column of Russian T-90 tanks and a brigade of, a division all by himself. He was wounded, bullet holes, bleeding in both legs, but somehow he guarded Snake Island and took out a division. You know, that shit that you hear every day about. So they knew it's just another day of these people telling their lies. And they'll say anything. So nobody really saw Petro Poroshenko as a reasonable figure that they should listen to what he said. So the Russians couldn't hang their hat on that. They couldn't say, guys, we can't do diplomacy with these people. Did you hear Petro Poroshenko? Because their allies were going to say, did we hear who? Petro Poroshenko? Really? This schmuck? So the Russians were like, man, we're working, we're trying. And then it became, wait a minute, forget Petro Poroshenko. Your dear and beloved Angela Merkel, the person that you and everybody in the world said, if only dear Angela was here, this mess would have never happened. And now she's come out and she said the same damn thing as Angela Merkel. The thing that we've been saying for years, these people are in agreement incapable, that they will sign an agreement. And as long as it benefits them, they're down with that agreement. As soon as it stops benefiting with them, they are out the door on that agreement. And that's where we are now. To quote the Russians, the positions of the parties are incompatible. So now don't get me wrong. I think the Russians are still going to kind of do a head nod a little bit. They can't just come out now, even though they've said that, but they can't just come out and just completely say, nope, we're not going to do any diplomacy under it. So they're just going to wink. They're going to say, all right, we got to fight this thing out. And if people say, what about diplomacy? They'll say, well, if we hear something, we got our ears to the ground. If somebody makes an offer, now we don't want to just hear, yeah, we need to talk to the Russians. If somebody makes a concrete offer and says, here's an offer, we'll read it and we'll consider it. Other than that, at the most, that's the best we can give you right now. If you've got a defined offer, we'll read it and consider it. Other than that, we got business to take care of in Ukraine. And I think the Russians realize at this point, here's the other thing, that they have the upper hand in Ukraine. Their troops are well fed. Their troops are well armed. Their troops are set up for their troops have a dominant position. And I think they realize that the Ukrainians have a couple of big problems, not the least of which being their troops can't be refreshed. They've been fighting. They've been losing a lot of troops. They've lost their best troops, and now they really have a lot of conscripts and things like that. Not saying that they can't or won't fight. I'm just saying they're not at their best, shall we say. They're very, very short of equipment. The United States and its allies and its colonies are running short of equipment to give them. So the Russians are like, basically the Russians are looking at it saying, time is on our side. The longer we hold this thing out, the harder it's going to get. And you see this, the Russians keep knocking out the electricity. They're creating, let's face it, and they were doing this on purpose. They're creating an infrastructure catastrophe. So what's going to happen? So you're going to have literally millions of Ukrainians. They are not going to be able to stay in Ukraine with no electricity. And if they get it back on, the Russians are going to knock it out. So they're going to have all of their major metropolitan centers freezing and below freezing. And they're going to have to drop all the water out of the buildings so that they won't freeze and bust. They're going to have no water. Where are they going to go to the bathroom? You know what I mean? Where are they going to take a bath? How are they? They'll have no economy. People go to work. There's nothing to work. You got no electricity. Nothing works. No jobs, no nothing. How are they going to? Well, one thing for sure, you won't need refrigeration because everything will be frozen and cold, right? But how do you transport foodstuffs around? How do people get money to buy the foodstuffs when there's no jobs and they can't work because the electricity and the infrastructure is stopped? You got a mess in Ukraine. You got an economic and an infrastructure disaster. So and the Russians are doing that on purpose. And of course, it makes it difficult. How does the Ukrainian military move their stuff around? It's going to be hard to get diesel fuel and electricity. How do they move their stuff and get their stuff back and forth to the front and rearm their soldiers and things of that nature? So They're going to create a catastrophe. They're creating a catastrophe in Ukraine. And how long can the Ukrainians keep doing that? Because one of the things that's going to happen, of course, is in very, very shortly, if not already, the Ukrainians are going to have to make a decision to get the Ukrainian people the hell out of the country. They're going to be, they're living in the Stone Ages. So now you're going to have, in the middle of winter, 10 million, 12 million Ukrainians coming across the border into Western Europe. You got another catastrophe there. You got another economic and infrastructure catastrophe there. Just a huge catastrophe, which from the Russians' position, it puts more pressure on the on the West, puts political pressure on them, it puts economic pressure on them, on and on and on. So they're putting the Russians don't have to do anything anytime soon. They don't have to make a deal. All they're saying is they're going to keep doing what they're going to do. So in a variety of ways, it's going to put pressure on their adversaries to do what they believe. And I believe the point, there will be a breaking point for the Europeans at some point. And the breaking point, not so much for the leaders of Europe, because the leaders of Europe are complicit. Understand this. My position is this. The Macrons and the Olaf Scholz of the world are not caught in the middle of this thing, and they don't know what to do. They're not vassals being pushed around. They're not pushing back against the U.S. They are complicit. They are people who, they're the viceroys. They work on behalf of the U.S. empire. Their job is to lie to their people. Their job is to hold their people off. Their job is to act on behalf of the Biden administration and not on behalf of their people. Their job is to tell their people, shut up and freeze and starve and go through whatever you got to go through. Just keep your mouth shut and do what the U.S. tells you. That's their job, to tell their people. Their job is not to alleviate the suffering of their people. If the U.S. says, I don't care if every German freezes to death and starves, it's Olaf Scholz's job to make sure they freeze to death and starve. Now, you know how I know that? Because that's what's happening right now. I don't have to guess and say, gee, I wonder what Olaf Scholz would do if his people were looking at starvation and poverty and death. We don't have to guess, because that's what they're looking at. And what is Olaf Scholz doing? Hey, guys, shut up and take it. It's your job. Do what you're told. The U.S. has said it's your time to go. And you know what that means? Unfortunately for you, but fortunately for me, your ass is grass. Shut up and die. In the same way that the U.S. says to the Ukrainians, look, we armed you and we set you up to be mowed down and ripped to shreds by artillery for the Russians. Your time. The Russian artillery's over there, head in that direction. Well, what's going to happen when I head in that direction? Artillery fire is going to rain down and your body will be torn to shreds. You got to understand. That's what we set your country up for. That's what we armed you for. That's what we fed you for the last 8 years, so that when it was time to die, that you would do your job and die. Now shut up and die. And at some point we'll be out of Ukrainians. Maybe they'll try Poles. Poles can die just as well as Ukrainians for the U.S. empire. So U.S. empire said, we got Romanians, we got Poles, we got all these Slavs. Throw them all the hell right into the fire and burn every last one of their lives. The U.S. was happy to do that. French, Germans, who cares? If they're stupid enough to do it, the U.S. is going to do it. And of course, the leaders of Russia, of the European colonies, their job is to throw their damn people right into the wood chipper, and they are happy to do it. And they are working on doing it. But before that happens, they have to make sure that all European industry ends up in the US. So really, they need the citizens of Europe, like Germany needs all of their workers, so that the workers will be there to help pack up the industry, to help box it up, put things together, get them all shipped over to the United States so that they can set back up there and work. And then once they're finished with those workers packing up their own country, their own jobs, and sending them overseas, well, then they can die after that. Who needs them? They're useless eaters. Who needs to feed them? Now you're done with them. So that's what Germany's job, all of them, that's what their job is to their people, to facilitate what the U.S. empire needs and then drop the hell dead. And your leaders in Europe are going to make sure that happens as best they can. Meanwhile, the Russians know it, and the Russians are like, our people are going to warm, our people are going to survive. And the Russians are like this: if we got to fight, we'll fight. The Russians, if they need to mobilize more people, they don't want a World War III, but if they need to do it, they'll do it. And right now, what are they doing? One of the things they're doing, if you look, the Russians are showing their latest nukes, right? They're brandishing their fangs. They're doing what in nature, what happens when an animal's cornered, what happens when an animal sees danger, makes itself look big. It shows you its fangs, it shows its claws, it says, you don't want to mess with me. It's going to be painful. And so the Russians are basically reminding the West, look, you'll all end up dead. We don't want to end up dead. You don't want to end up dead. Don't forget, we have the capability to kill every one of you. And if you back us into the corner and we feel like we're going down, we'll do it. Don't you forget that. Don't play with us. That's why the Russians have been showing their latest nukes and their launchers and all of that. It's a reminder to the West. You don't want this. You will end this U.S. empire once and for all, and you know it, and you know we can do it. As well as you all the mouth you got. You step wrong, this fight's over. So don't play with us. That's the Russian lately showing all this stuff about their nukes. Just a reminder. That's all. And I mean, in a fight, if you feel that your life is in danger and you remind your opponent, look, I got a grenade, I'll pull the pin. If I feel like you're going to kill me, I'm going to pull the pin and we're both going to die. So you ain't going to win this. There's no realm in which you win this fight. I think that's what the Russians are doing. And now they're basically this. We're on our border. See, think about this. The Russians are on their border. They ain't going to stop fighting. They're not going to stop fighting until they've won this. That's why they put it. And they could, and if need be, if they need to mobilize, people are like, will they mobilize more? If they feel they need to, they'll put another 500,000. They'll put another million, or they'll 1.5 million. Whatever size army the Russians need, they will do it because they are on their border. They have a superpower, the U.S., that is on their border saying, we want to overthrow your government and take everything you got and kill some of you. And the Russians' position is, yeah, well, we'll see about that. We'll fight hard. And on our border, as Obama said it. He said, what he said was Putin will always have escalatory dominance in that part of the world. In other words, you're on Russia's border. Russia's military is designed to fight on its border. If you get in that fight, man, you're going to have a bad time on Russia's border. Do you really want? You don't want that on their border. And that the Russians are reminding people, you don't want this. So what happens now? I'm running my mouth a long time. This is what I'll get to. The Russians are just saying there's no chance of dialogue. That dog don't hunt no more. Those days are gone. So what they're saying is we're going to knock the hell out of Ukraine. And so people are saying, what are they going to do? Will they go to Transnistria? Will they go to Odessa? Will they do this? They've made their decision. And you would have to assume that they're going max. You would have to assume at this point that since they have made a decision that there ain't no way to diplomacy their way out of this, that yeah, they're going to all of that stuff. Kharkov, Odessa, land bridge to Transnistria. You would have to assume, knowing like they know that their adversary means to destroy them, that they're going to take the max. They're going to landlock Ukraine. They're going to knock the hell out of them. And meanwhile, as they do that and they wait, the longer they do that, the more the European economy starts to fall apart, the more the excuse me, the Europeans suffer, and the European electorate starts to get angry and starts demanding that their puppet leaders act. I suspect Europe, at some point, there could be violence in Europe. The people could be, once the European people get to the point where they wake up and they, get to the truth, and they're like, my God, we don't have independence, we don't have sovereignty, and we don't even have leaders, and we have to restructure our governments and bring in all new people because the government that we have is a comprador class. The government that we have is Nietzsche government, right? Once they get to that point, they will have given up on the class of leaders that they have, and they're going to have to restructure things, and that could get violent. Let's just say, as they talk about budgets and they say some cuts may be necessary. Yeah, those cuts could be at the hands of a guillotine. And I'm just saying this. I think there's going to be significant electoral changes within the next couple of years in Europe. And in the same way that the Russians have said the chances for dialogue with the Macrons and the Schultzes and the Bidens of this world are over, I think at some point the people in Germany, the people in France, the people in these European countries are going to say the same thing. They're going to look at their government and they're going to say, you screwed us so bad. You destroyed our lives. You put us in misery and hell. You sent our industry across the seas. We can't bargain with you. We just need a new government. Now, what happens to them? I don't know. But the people there ain't going to be happy. So we shall see. So let's look and see whether or not we have some super chats. I think we do. And I'm going to answer them now. Okay. You ready? Let's go. Oh my God. That's a name that I don't know. Ivica Marjanovic Muleheim and Maine, Germany. Okay, thank you very much. Garland, what do you think would be necessary to happen to have German masses turn their back to this sick empire and their helpers in power and politics and media? I think it's going to happen, but I think it's going to be pain. It's going to be horrific pain, horrific economic pain, which means that look, the U.S. industry wants Siemens and BMW and all these other countries to move their industrial base to the United States. So the question, I think, is not will the Germans wake up at some point and realize they've been had? It's will it be too late? And I think the plans of the U.S. empire is we're going to take all your industry and move it here. So even if you do wake up and realize that we screwed you, it's too late. You know, the old joke, don't never criticize a man until you've walked a mile in his shoes, because number one, you're a mile away, and number two, you got his shoes, right? He's shoeless, and it's a lot easier to deal with a guy when he doesn't have any shoes. No, okay. So I think the U.S. is going to be like, okay, we're going to steal all of their industry. We're going to leave them impoverished. Are they going to get pissed? Probably, but by then we'll have their industry and they'll be impoverished. What are they going to do? They'll be weak. They'll be broke. They'll have no jobs. So I think when the German people wake up, the only thing they're going to have left is blue and yellow flags, and those things don't eat well, and they can't keep you warm. Oh, we got something. Do we have another one? Zimba, what's up, Dr. Garland? Thank you, Zach Boyles. Dr. Boyles. Let's go here. Here's one. Did you read Ally versus Ally? Was it prophetic? You know what? Here's the problem. I'm having trouble. I've been searching for that book. I can't find my book. I don't know what the hell I did with my book. Looking all over creation for it. I don't see it here. I'm glad you reminded me. I got to look for it again. I cannot find my stinking Ally versus Ally book. I was reading it, so let's hope I find it. I'm glad you reminded me. I'm going to look around again today. Maybe I can find it. Thank you. Thank you. Anthony Blinken's book, Ally versus Ally. Here's another one. Been watching you for a while now and love how you explain things. What's your opinion on personal investments in Ukraine after the war? Trying to figure out how I can make money on all this human suffering. Ha. Well, let me say this, and I added the ha. It ain't going to be no place to put your money. It's going to be a rump state. It's going to be where they can do nothing but maybe a little bit of agriculture. All of the best agricultural areas will be in the east, and they'll be taken. So that ain't going to be a place to put your money. Put it like that. It's going to be a falling apart, and anything worth anything, the neoliberals will have already taken. So yeah, nah, yeah, no. That's what, as they say. Yeah, no. All right, we're going over and look on Rockfin. And Free Thinker 59 says, Garland, you always say it straight but threaded in such a folksy, relatable way. I love you, man. Thank you for all you do. Thank you very much, Free Thinkers 59. Stargazer says, oh, thanks a lot, Stargazer. Certainly appreciate that. We got a tip from Stargazer. Let's keep looking. JVB, thank you very much, JVB. JVB didn't have a question. Same with Freethinker 59 and Bill Wilson. Oh, okay. Ronnie Graham says, great work, Garland. Back on Twitter. Hopefully Scott next. Let's keep our fingers crossed about that. All right. Thanks a lot, everybody. Well, I think that's it. As I say, wow, 1,400 people. So everybody's out tonight. Wonderful. Thanks a lot. As I always say, look, you never know. I could get crapped out tomorrow on YouTube. So please follow me. We got 1,406 people. That means we should have 1,406 likes. Everybody like it. Make sure you're subscribed. If you're on Rockfin, do me a favor. If you're not on Rockfin, everybody go to rockfin.com/Garland Nixon and become a member. Absolutely free. It costs nothing to become a member. And in case they toss me off of YouTube, you'll know where to find me. Let me add one more important thing about Rockfin, and that is Rockfin is a free speech dialogue, a free speech platform, does not show any it doesn't show any advertisement. So if you can become a subscriber. Again, I need to find out. I don't know. It's somewhere between $9.99 and $14.99 a month to become a subscriber. If you subscribe for a year, you get 2 free months. So it's a lot. So it's cheaper than that if you subscribe for a year. Do the math, right? So if you can become a subscriber, what that will do is every content creator on Rockfin does one premium show each week. Mine is 9 o'clock Wednesday morning with Scott Ritter, and you can see the premium shows, although I show almost half of it on every other platform anyway. So thanks a lot. You see all the Buy Me a Coffee, Patreon. If you can do something, $1, $3, $5, $100 a month, whatever you could do on Patreon is certainly appreciated. buymeacoffee.com/Garland in with a friggin' H on the end. Why they stuck that, I don't know. And of course, Cash App. If you can do anything to help the channel going, thank you very much. If not, and if you don't have much money, don't do it. Keep your money for your family. Take care of your family. If you can afford it, that's great. If you can't, just do me a favor, share as much of this content as you can on all of your platforms. Thank you very much, everybody. Have a wonderful evening, and I will be back on tomorrow. Have a great evening. Bye.